Good afternoon and welcome to How to Utilize Data to Create a Competitive Advantage Beyond Compliance. Today, it's necessary for financial institutions to establish proper data governance programs that go beyond checking the box on the collection, management, and integration of data. Today's webinar will cover the components of an effective program and how banks can use their established data policy to comply with current and future regulations. We'll also discuss how to use this policy as a competitive advantage. Thanks for joining us. I'm Emily McCormick, the Vice President of Research at Bank Director. I coordinate and execute our research projects, including our annual surveys and ranking banking study. I also write for Bank Director Magazine and bankdirector.com. Today's webinar is brought to you by both Bank Director and Baker Tilly US LLP. Bank Director has served as an information resource to the financial community since 1991, focusing on the strategic issues most fundamental to bank C-suites and boards. Baker Tilly US is a leading advisory, tax, and assurance firm that helps its clients adapt to an ever-evolving business world. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items to share with you. First off, don't worry, we can't hear you. You're in listen-only mode for this webinar. We do recommend that you click on the slide bar at the bottom of the screen to adjust between the presenters and the presentation as you prefer. If you have questions for our speakers, you can note those by clicking the Q&A button found on the right-hand side of your screen. You can do this at any time during the presentation, and we definitely encourage you to ask questions. Once our presenters have finished with their talking points, we'll have a brief Q&A period, and we'll address as many questions as we can during that time. There's no need to take detailed notes. We'll share the presentation with all attendees within 24 hours via email. You'll also be able to find it on bankdirector.com. For technical issues, you can note those using the moderator chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll also use polls during the presentation. Those will appear in the sidebar near the Q&A button. When you've selected your answer, just hit the vote button and we'll get your response in. Finally, the opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the individual speaker only and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the other speakers or of the entities with which the speakers are associated. So with that, let me introduce our speakers. Dave DeVarney is a principal at Baker Tilly US. He has almost 2 decades of experience in business intelligence, and he's passionate about helping businesses drive sustainable growth through digital transformation and data analytics solutions. Sean Statz is a senior manager at Baker Tilly US, who specializes in providing data analytics and financial modeling services to financial institutions, and he touts more than a decade of expertise working with the financial industry. With that, I'll pass it over to Sean and Dave.
Thank you, Emily. Let's get our here quick. Hi, everyone, and yeah, thanks for joining. My name is Sean Statz. Hopefully you can see my screen up here. I am a senior manager at Baker Tilly, as Emily said. I'm with the firm for about 2 years and help lead all things data analytics and financial modeling for financial institutions specifically. So a lot of asset liability management work, liquidity work, and ramping up now, excuse me, more CECL type work. So thank you for joining. Today we're going to talk about how to utilize your data to create that competitive advantage just beyond compliance. So I'll start by talking through some compliance issues, compliance challenges as they continue to be a huge overhaul for institutions, and just try to provide some ideas and recommendations about how you can build some efficiency or get some more value out of some processes that you're doing to satisfy some of those requirements. Dave will then take over and talk about some data governance issues, you know, what data governance is, some areas to focus on, and then he'll end with some data strategy. So again, what data strategy means to you, the people, the technology, the processes that are involved in data strategy, and some best practices and outcomes of what that looks like. The introductions here. So data and compliance. Compliance in today's environment, consistently a top challenge, said by you all, said by bankers across the entire banking industry for many years, and definitely don't see this going away. The rules just keep expanding, the policies keep expanding, and definitely things are getting more and more transparent. And again, we don't see this going away. So our point here is today's presentation is what else can we get? We're checking the box on a lot of these compliance issues, but what other value is there when we have to aggregate and segment all of this data? What else can we get out of it? We're going to be talking a lot about CECL today, as it's the compliance issue that's probably the most popular right now. I know there's a lot going on in the CECL world, a lot of webinars, so hopefully we bring a different aspect to it. But even when I think back of CECL when it was introduced 5.5 years ago now, it's ever evolving, right? I mean, it's consistent, constantly changes, and even the FASB wrote out 2 more projects recently that they're thinking about amendments to TDRs and other things, but it's ever evolving, so it's hard to stay on top of it. And the costs related to that compliance is definitely continue to rise and continue to be a large challenge for all of you, whether it's bringing on resources, whether it's investing in technology to satisfy these requirements, or whether it's outsourcing some of these compliance, outsourcing your ALM or your CECL. The costs are all associated with all of them. So like I said, we'll go over CECL today. For the majority of you, effective date is 1/1/2023. SEC filers are currently affected, so we'll go through some things that, some challenges that they've had, or some challenges that some clients of ours had that are through the implementation process. It was interesting. We actually did an external webinar a few weeks ago, and we learned that 100+ banks were on that call, and we learned that 60 to 70% of them actually haven't started anything for CECL yet, or just in the very beginning stages. So there's 15 months left. We definitely think this is a high priority at this point, and definitely want to kind of start understanding now the data that's associated with CECL and what you all need to do to know what you have internally and what you may need to outsource. So when I think about CECL, I think about 3 big changes. The first one is the lifetime loss. Now it's not a 1 or 2 year look back. It's a lifetime loss. So that certainly creates a lot more data that you'll need and to calculate that. And that's a lot of data internally that institutions will have to go back and determine if they have it. But with that internal data also comes this industry data, these industry sources, in order to satisfy that reasonable and supportable forecast requirement that's in there too. That we'll touch on some of the industry sources, but it's certainly okay to use industry sources, whether it's to fill gaps in your data or it's to bring in different forecasts using different economic inputs, as long as, again, they're reasonable, supportable for your institution, the region that you're in, that sort of thing. So we'll talk more about that in a few slides. And then the last one that's probably a big change is just the variety of methods used to calculate CECL. There's a wide variety, ranging from simple methods, from the WARM method or the scale method that was introduced over the summer for those institutions that might be smaller, less complex, that don't have a lot of data. So it helps substitute the lack of data with some more industry type data. And then there's more complex methodologies as well, that your discounted cash flow approach, your PD/LGD methods, that are for those institutions that have that data, that have those resources or technology to perform that type of calculation for their CECL. But the point is those methods are meant for flexibility, meant for, you can choose one that's right for your institution. They've added a lot of confusion for a lot of our clients, but they're really there meant for flexibility to go back and look at what data do we have, what method is the right for our institution. So again, you can use different methods for different product types depending on that data. Some of your longer term, your products that have been with you for many, many years, may have a more complex method versus some of the new products that don't have a lot of data. That's where you have the flexibility to use a more simple method. We'll talk more about that as well. CECL's biggest challenges. We get this question a lot, trying to learn from other people that have implemented or that are beginning to implement. What was their biggest challenges? What can I learn from it? we consistently hear the same few challenges that I'm sure all of you are going through as well. The first one just being understanding the guidance. A couple hundred pages long. It's again constantly changing, but just making sure that you all understand exactly what is in scope and what the impact to your institution is, and getting a committee that can fully understand that. We always recommend building a committee with a variety of departments on there that everyone will understand a different aspect that maybe someone else didn't, or they'll understand it more than maybe someone else didn't. So that's definitely important, is to get that variety on your CECL implementation team. The second challenge is these new methods. We walked through that. There's a lot of challenges of which one's right for me. We'll touch on that in a bit. But the main one, and really the point of this presentation, is the data. Everything CECL and data is huge. Coming from the retrieval process, what data do we even have, all the way up to getting it out of the core, aggregating it, segmenting it to like products, and then ultimately modeling it. That's been really the biggest challenge for CECL. And with that data comes a lot of its own challenges that we'll hopefully be able to provide some recommendations and ideas to help steer you in the right direction as you do your CECL. So those data challenges surrounding CECL, what are they? What do we hear from clients, from the regulators put out FAQs out there? What are they hearing? First off, it just requires too much data. We hear this a lot. CECL is this big compliance standard, and it requires a ton of data. And it's true, it does require a lot of data. But what we try to tell our clients is really take a step back, try to understand what data are we already pulling, what data are we extracting, what data are we analyzing already on a quarterly basis. I always point my clients to their asset liability management platform. A lot of them are finding out that that's a great complement to CECL, that they're pulling loan trial balances on a quarterly basis already. So what can we find there in CECL that will provide value or build efficiencies as we implement CECL? A lot of times you'll find out that a lot of that same data you may be pulling, again, whether it's for ALM or if it's for loan analytics or for it's budgeting. A lot of that data may be already coming out of the system. So start taking a step back and looking at what is already there. The next one is, well, each model requires different data, and this is true, but how I think of this one is that flexibility approach, that really try to understand each model and what data it requires, and that may help you steer you in a direction of what model you should use. If you don't have a lot of the data that's required for the more complex methods, that steers you into those more simple methods, and that's why those WARM or those scale methods are out there for institutions like that. Vice versa, if we have the data to run a more discounted cash flow type approach, that is probably the most accurate and reasonable for your institution. So help understand what inputs are required that may help weed out some of those methods and help you nail down what method is right for your institution. The $1 million question that we get a lot again is, how far back should my data go? This one is again all up to your institution. Really what we recommend is as far back as possible. We see a lot of institutions that have great data going back 10, 15 years. It had the last recession and how the loans performed during that last recession and subsequent recovery, and being able to use that data to then project forward. But on the other side, we see a lot of institutions that only have really good data for the last 3 to 5 to 7 years. And that's okay too. But understanding what data you have and then what gaps you need to fill and start bringing in some of those industry sources is key now, so that you can start vetting that data, you can fine tune that data throughout the next year in order for the implementation beginning in 2023. And with those clients that only have the 3 to 7 years of data, we hear a lot of that. Well, we don't have any loss history, and we had loss history 10 plus years ago, but over the last, all my data has no loss history. This is again, start looking at some peer data, or overall charge-off rates by industry back in the recession to see how those loans did. But this is the perfect example of looking out there and trying to find some of those industry sources to use for more of that qualitative approach for CECL. Recent client obstacles, we put this slide in here. We had 2 real use cases as we work with institutions on their implementation, and thought we would include them in here. just as a challenge. The first one being, we sat with an institution and their implementation team and walked them through different data that they would need in order to perform a specific methodology. And the management team, nodded their head, and we have all of that data. That should be great. And we should be fine with this methodology. And about a week later, we came back, and after they really dived into their core system, they actually didn't have the data. And it was, some simple fields that they thought, why wouldn't we be tracking that type deal? But actually they didn't have it. So again, which is okay, and they're starting to track it. But this is a great reason to bring someone onto the CECL committee, maybe from your IT department, or that knows the data, so that when you're discussing different methodologies and different avenues to go, they'll be able to answer real time, whether that's possible, whether that's feasible, whether we have that data or not. The second one is more on the vendor side. This was one that reached out to us that initially had thought that the vendor is taking care of everything, from gathering the data to segmenting the loans to coming up with assumptions on the loss rates, when in reality it was just, here's the software, you need to run it. So, and then the institution was on the hook for gathering all the data and segmenting it and that sort of thing. So this is just something, as you begin to search out vendors, ask those questions about what they're going to do on the data side. Are they going to help you segment the loans? Are they going to help you, recommend different aggregations of like products, or even develop some of your assumptions? So that's certainly important for them to know your data as well. You just don't want to be providing your data to a vendor that's just running it through a model. You want that vendor to understand you as an operation, your data, and how you operate, so that the answer, the CECL estimate, is best for your institution, is most supportable. So CECL assumptions and your data, trying to build some of these assumptions off your data, or just trying to look further into the institution to see, maybe what we are doing on other models that maybe we can pull into our CECL. So the key assumptions are those four that we have listed: the loss rates, the prepayment speeds, with the contractual information we can get to average life, and then finally forecasting. But these are the main four, and if you take a step back and again look at other models that you may be using in the institution, you may be having prepayment speeds and an average life calculated through your ALM process, or you may have loss rate information from months or quarters worth of trial balance data that you can begin to calculate loss rate. So but the point here is in that graphic to the right is just a high level graphic of some common banking models. You've got your CECL, liquidity, capital adequacy, and maybe it's a software, maybe it's an Excel file. But the point being is that we really believe that all of these models should be talking to each other, and that we should be trying to identify interdependencies between these models in order to, again, build efficiencies, minimize risk, and looking at risk on an integrated basis. We see too many times that silo approach to these models, where there's different departments working with different models, and each department pulls the data from the core system and inputs the assumptions and then runs the model. And what we really think is best practice is to look at it more holistically, to try to develop a centralized data set that you can pull from the core system, you can vet, you can analyze that data, make sure it's accurate, and then start passing along to all of the models, where then you have a centralized assumption set. If we have ALM prepayments, should we be using those on the CECL side, so that that when you're updating or adjusting assumptions, you can look at the risk, not only to your credit risk, but you can see how that impacts interest rate risk, liquidity risk, and impacts to capital. It helps with management reporting to see all of that at once. And again, it minimizes just the errors of data. It minimizes user error, because all of the data that's going into the models are the same. I touched on this before, but look back at the processes then you're using for the models that you have in place now. So what processes do I have on my asset liability management? Do I have quarterly, we worked with a client a while back that had been providing quarterly loan data extracts to their third-party provider for, I think it was 12 years. So they're going to use all of that data to start analyzing those loan behaviors over time, looking at what was prepaid, if they had contractual information. They had some risk rating data in there, so they could see the migrations of those risk ratings, and they're ultimately going to use that migration for their CECL estimate. So average lives go into that as well, but that gets to the whole idea of this value beyond just checking the box, value beyond compliance. Yes, they set aside their ALM compliance, but can they use that now to dive into CECL? Or can they use those loan polls for other metrics? And for that example, they built a migration trend to predict behaviors in certain loan products in certain regions. So with that, we get to our first polling question. How well prepared is your data to meet current compliance requirements? A, we have all of the information. It's well organized and accessible to generate new models and complete compliance efforts. B, with some effort, we can source and model the data we need for compliance. C, we spend a significant amount of time collecting the information we need to support compliance. And D, not applicable. So we'll let this go for a few seconds while you share your answers. We ask this question a lot, and we're definitely seeing a trend now from more of the C answers going up to with some effort, and it's becoming more and more organized as this idea of data is becoming more and more of a hot topic, and the idea of developing a data strategy is kind of putting up on the top of the priority list for a lot of management teams. So I'm seeing the results come in live here. Great, yeah, almost 50% have answered A. So our information is well organized. Almost 30% in B and 20% in C. So those 20% and 30% in B and C. Hopefully you can learn something. But also, again, the importance of this data idea is not going away, and it's one of the most valuable assets that you as a banking institution have. And how can we use that data to complete these compliant metrics is key. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Dave.
All right. Do you want me to pick up the screen sharing? I can do that.
Yeah, sure. You have it.
All right. Sean can check me and say, am I in the right spot?
You're good. I see it up here.
Okay, perfect. Well, Sean, I appreciate that. I'm going to really talk about, as we really talk about the value of data and going beyond compliance, there were kind of two core concepts that I wanted to emphasize. So one of those is data governance, which I'm going to go through first, and then the other one is data strategy. And these are really kind of two overarching programs that organizations can decide to adopt and really will help move that maturity level of the organization forward as they try to leverage the data, again, beyond compliance. If you have to go in, you have to touch it, you have to manipulate it, you have to extract it for compliance, why not go in and actually implement some of these programs to go in and help use it in a much broader context? So let's start with data governance and talk a little bit first about why is data governance important? So what we see in the industry, kind of four main factors, but I think it goes beyond this. Four main factors that are driving governance. One, you're seeing a significantly larger amount of data. So even within the banking industry, you do have online platforms, you see interactions within those platforms, that all of that data is being stored and captured. The big data movement, I mean, we are a ways past the big data movement, but it's here and it's going to stay. Self-service reporting and analytics, the demands for actually pulling information from an organization are becoming significantly higher than they were in the past. We've always had a self-service kind of bent. We want to provide that decision-making power into the organization. We want to let people pull their own reports. That only increases over time and through generations. So we have to have governance around that. everything Sean just talked about, regulatory and compliance requirements, right? How are you tracking certain pieces of data? Are you protecting that information? Are you making sure from a compliance standpoint you have everything in check? And then the last piece, and really on the front end of it, is machine learning and artificial intelligence. So as we talk about leveraging data to do predictive analytics or data science, those things, again, need a solid foundation to drive off of. I can't make predictive decisions off of poor data. I need high quality data to do that. So these are kind of 4 driving factors that we see within the market as it relates to governance. And really then, what is data governance? Data governance generally is a program that will be stood up within an organization. It constitutes kind of 2 things: the framework that you're going to implement and the goals that you want to accomplish with it. When we work with an organization, we tend to go through several steps to establish a data governance program. The beginning piece of those steps is really to understand what exists today, because even if an organization feels like their data is all over the place, it's poor quality, we don't have standard definitions, there are some elements of data governance that are likely happening. They just aren't happening in a clean and consistent manner. So we start out with moving through those elements, then we get down to the framework pieces. What are we trying to achieve from establishing a data governance program? Who should be the people that participate in that data governance program? What are the operating procedures they're going to have to kind of help facilitate that? And also not to become a burdensome element of governance either. We don't want to establish a data governance program where really we've just created a bunch of gatekeepers. What we want to do is more of quality checks, a place to say, hey, if I have a question about what should a metric mean, how should it be captured, who should have access to it, those things can come through really the frameworks of a well-built data governance program. So let's talk a little bit about what are the focused areas of a data governance program. And an organization could have one of these, could have all of them, or some combination. Most people, when they think of governance, think about policy standards and really the procedures that you're going to follow. Absolutely, that's a part of data governance. We can write policies around how do we add new security groups to a given database. That could be a policy. We could have policies, maybe we're talking about a data warehouse. We could have a policy around what elements should go into the data warehouse, which elements shouldn't go into the data warehouse. So all those policies and standards can be a big focus of data governance. Data quality is another major area. Data quality is an ongoing living thing that's going to happen in an organization. A lot of times within a data governance program, part of their charter or part of their responsibility will be to monitor and maintain a certain level of data quality. There's a concept within data governance called the data steward. So the data steward will own a domain of the data. Within the data governance program, we can set up quality metrics for that information. We can say, hey, X percentage of the addresses must be correct, or X, the grand total dollars in a given amount shouldn't go beyond a given threshold. Those data quality standards are applied to that domain. And then really you're measuring what's happening there over time to make sure that the data quality stays the same. Because we can see within an organization, processes change, maybe a person shifted roles, and all of a sudden you're getting bad data into your systems, and you don't want that. Privacy, compliance, and security can be another area, another focus area for data governance. So again, where do we have to store sensitive information? Do we have to physically segregate sensitive information? Who should be responsible for segregating that? Who has access to that? We've worked with organizations, they might have specific recipes that they use that are very sensitive to them, not exactly like Kentucky Fried Chicken and their chicken recipe, but similar to where you want to keep those areas tightly knit. And privacy is becoming more of an element as we see governmental organizations putting in new privacy regulations that then companies must follow. I mean, think about some of the GDPR is a good example, doesn't always apply to us, but we're starting to see elements of it here in the United States. If you had to go track down a certain piece of specific personal information about an individual, that could live in multiple systems. So from a privacy perspective, we want to know how are we handling that, where are those elements. Data governance can focus on architecture and integration. What systems should talk to each other? What system should be the primary system of record? How do they interact with each other? We can talk about data warehousing and business intelligence within governance. This is where when you have a key performance indicator, maybe a specific hierarchy about how you talk about your business, these are things where data governance would have a hand in saying, yes, this is the appropriate customer hierarchy. And one that we bump into in banking quite often is how do you define a household? That can be a data governance area. What defines a household? What happens when a household separates? Maybe a child moves out. Is it now two households? How do I look at it historically? All of those things would happen from a data warehousing and business intelligence perspective. And then the last piece is management and support. So what do we need to do to facilitate the appropriate level of data governance within the organization? How are we supporting different areas of the business that are going to interact with us? So this can be a function that's, and generally is a function that's somewhat centralized. You have a certain committee of individuals who are responsible for these areas. Again, you're writing policies and procedures to kind of drive them out. So that encompasses kind of everything when we talk about data governance, high quality data, moving those pieces together. These are some of the major focus areas that you would generally look at. All right, so we're going to jump to the next polling question, or the second one. How well established are your data governance policies and procedures? And I don't have the BlueJeans screen up, so maybe as we go through it, Sean will help me with what the results are, or anyone.
Yep, I can. Right now we're seeing about 67%. It's moving pretty quick. It's pretty early. I'll give it a second here. Still some responses coming in. It looks like the majority is B here, with A and C pretty split.
Perfect.
Almost 50% there on B. The other two, 20. A had 22% and C had 28%.
Okay. Well, it's great to see that some organizations actually have set data governance org and define policies and procedures. And I think, again, when we talk about banking, that's not surprising that some of those elements already exist within the organization. It's a highly regulated industry. It is very sensitive information, so it makes sense that those elements are there. Also, not surprised that we have a huge number within B. Again, when you don't have a formalized data governance program, what you're going to see is kind of ad hoc governance happening. You might have different areas of the business that have their own policies and procedures, but they don't really live centrally. There's not a cohesiveness to them. So that's when you want to take a look at, hey, should we establish a broader governance framework around our data? Again, as a key asset within the organization, can be really a major piece to make sure you hang on to. All right, so that's governance, right? Everything about frameworks, policies around data, making sure you have good quality checks on it, making sure that you know where information lives. Really, it's all around, that's data management, right? What's the data that we have? How are we effectively managing it? The second portion that I wanted to talk about is strategy. So strategy really drives us around, what are we trying to do? When do we do it? And why does it drive our business? And Sean kind of alluded to this as he talked about your need to go and aggregate data to pull data to meet compliance requirements. Once you have to do that, an analytical strategy would say, is there a better way for me to pull that data, store that data, and aggregate that data? So one, I'm not putting all the effort into it every single time I have to meet a requirement, but two, is there insight in that data beyond what the compliance requirement is, so I can pull it again, leverage it again to make informed decisions? When we talk about data strategy sometimes gets confused with tools, right? The bottom left side here, technology. Technology is one portion of strategy. The technology around what tools are we going to invest in? Do those tools align to our business? Do we have the people in place to support those tools? But it's not the whole picture. And tools do not solve a broader data strategy issue, which tends to revolve around how am I leveraging the information? What am I doing with it? We also have to consider people when we talk about data strategy. When we talk about people, we're really talking about giving them the right information to, one, enable what they need to do, but then also empower them and communicate clearly. There's a nice overlap with governance when we talk about the people side of data, because one, we do want it well governed, but we also want to be fairly open and transparent generally about the types of data that we're sharing, especially when we're talking about operational metrics, how we're measuring ourselves. The process side of the house is a lot of what I just talked about in governance. However, it also exists around planning. So we all have limited resources in what we can do. If we're trying to build out a large centralized data repository, or maybe we've taken that and we've broken it out into different business areas and we're building marts, for lack of a better term, for those business areas, we want some element of planning and prioritization as far as what should go in those areas. How do we ingest requirements? How do we make sure that those requirements are being delivered effectively to the business? I don't know how many people out there, this isn't our polling question, but one thing that I always think about is how many people, as they deal with getting access to data or really leveraging that data, how much of it is this kind of squeaky wheel gets the grease? So the areas that are the loudest get the most attention, while other areas tend to be a little bit starved for information. The last element of strategy that we look at is the organization itself. So as an organization tries to embark on its data strategy journey, do you have the right sponsorship? And this really has to be kind of a top-down sponsorship. Does the executive team within the organization value what data can do for the company? There's many organizations that I've been in front of where management has traditionally not had a large amount of access to data. Maybe they rely on financial reports once a month to really run the business. And the rest of it, honestly, is gut feel, intuition. If that's the notion of the organization, hey, we know how to do this. We don't need to pull these reports. We don't need to integrate all of this. Data science and machine learning doesn't sound kind of fanciful. You're going to have a hard time having a program adopted within the organization. The organization has to have some element of agility. The needs and requirements from a data perspective are going to change, just like compliance elements change over time. So you need to be able to have an agile working environment where you can kind of move and change, maybe bring in new sources of data, enhance old sources of data. Systems are going to change in an organization, so you need that agility to move. And then you have to have some vision of where you're going. What are the things that are important to measure? And the vision one is interesting because where the organization wants to go, where they want to focus, should feed into the planning process of what things do we need to bring to the forefront and what should we pull in first. So these are the components in the areas that we look at when we're talking about a data strategy. We want to make sure it's holistic. We're not just talking about the technology, but we have to think about the people that are impacted, the processes we're going to implement, and how the organization is going to adopt that change. A big piece of that strategy also involves us taking a look at and really thinking about where are you from an analytical maturity perspective. A lot of organizations are still in and continue to be in kind of this hindsight phase, right? They can see what has happened in the past. They have a significant amount of operational reporting. They might even be overwhelmed with hundreds of operational reports, some of which haven't been touched in years, but somebody needed it at one time. And so now we have this massive report library that's out there. That's all our descriptive analytics. What happened? What happened in the past? Now, from a impact perspective, the what happened is interesting, but it is not going to help us make decisions and really capitalize on that data going forward. So the second piece is to drill down and to say, why did it happen? The why in the context of banking and really being more diagnostic would be things like thinking about analyzing a set of loan portfolio. What are the attributes that are really driving good or bad performance within that? So this is things like data visualization, being able to do modeling on top of the data. But again, you're still looking backwards. You still have historical data, you're looking back at it, but you have a little bit better interactivity into how you can actually move through, pivot it, twist and turn that information to look at it. When we talk about kind of a higher level of maturity and we start to think about things like machine learning and AI, this is when we start to look into the future and we get into the foresight. So this is when we're forecasting. We're looking at a set of loans, and we're forecasting which ones are going to be profitable, and we're forecasting which ones might cause issues for us. We're looking at accounts as they're opened, and again, we're forecasting forward what could happen or what we believe happened. Now, that looking forward is always based on historical data, accurately modeling good historical data to then make predictions about the future. The last and most mature area that we get into from a data and analytics perspective is when we're doing predictive analytics and we're actually starting to make decisions. We're already starting to automate decisions. Loan decisions is a good example. We're automating a loan decision, or we're at least automating the level of checks that have to happen. So all of this is predicated on you have to have a good quality foundation of data, and you're kind of moving across this continuum as you mature as an organization. And I wouldn't say it's, even though our diagram is kind of linear, it's not really a linear progression. It's a little bit of you kind of go up, you'll plateau for a little while, you'll go up, you'll plateau, you'll go up, and you'll plateau. But be mindful that you can't jump to the right-hand side without at least moving through some good elements of good descriptive historical data to then move into your prescriptive and predictive information. Really how you're going to move through the maturity curve. I think there's one other thing I want to say about the maturity curve, but I have to save it for another time. All right, so you have 4 areas that you look at when we're talking about data strategy. When we talk about data strategy, we're moving through the maturity curve. The last piece is, if you were going to go through an assessment and say, all right, what are the things I need to do to maybe kick off a data and analytics program? Maybe I don't have one centralized yet today. How do I get that started? There's basically really 4 key deliverables that you would want to get or garner to move that forward. One is is an opportunity matrix. So the opportunity matrix is a collection of scoring that is done generally against different data domains. And I use that word a little bit. The data domains could be things like loans or loan performance. That might be a data domain within your organization. You take the data domain and you look at how much of that information, how high quality is it? So I look at some of the technical aspects of it. How easy is it for me to get? How much quality do I have around the data? If I want to get a metric out of that, do I have to do heavy transformations? And that gives me a technical scoring of that information. The second piece to it is to say, okay, that piece of data domain, that KPI or group of KPIs that I want to look at, what business value do they represent? What impact are they going to give me? Take those 2 things together. We happen to have a scoring matrix when we go through a data strategy with an organization. Our scoring mechanism will move those different data domains up and to the right if they have a high impact, high technical feasibility, and down and to the left for the low impact, low feasibility. The reason we do this is because, again, anybody who's ever tried to tackle kind of this problem of data within their organization and they want to get their hands around all the enterprise information, there's no way you're going to do it all at once. You need to have a mechanism to prioritize. So building out an opportunity matrix to say business value versus technical feasibility is a great way to kind of focus in on those elements of the top right that are going to mean the most. And then later, as you go and mature, you're going to pick up the ones potentially on the bottom and the bottom left. The second part of it is to really understand the dimensional model of the business. How do we describe ourselves? Again, within banking, there's a lot of standard KPIs, but there might be elements. I kind of mentioned this notion of the household. How do we talk about the household? How are we representing the household? What are those elements that are there? So the bus matrix or the dimensional model, and this could come in a couple of different flavors. This is just one that we've used in the past, but effectively it's the business representation of those data domains. Those elements then drive out solution concepts. So how are we going to move data? How are we going to expose data? And this used to be a very kind of black or white decision of how you were going to move data. Everything was going to move into some big giant data warehouse, and then it was going to move into reports. And what we're seeing is much more flexible architectures now, where we might move certain elements of it into maybe more of like a product, where we say, okay, this chunk of data, we have a team, they own it, they take it from beginning to end, but everything that's within it, they're the owners of, and then they expose it through reports or maybe an ad hoc tool like Tableau or Power BI, whatever that might be. So you have your solution concept. So those are three kind of main deliverables when we talk about data strategy. It's what am I prioritizing? What's the broad model of the business that I'm looking at? And what's the solution I'm trying to build? Once you have that laid down, you really get into execution. And within execution, there's kind of two pieces. We don't have it up here, but the first one is roles. So what are the roles that I need to support that? Those might be roles that exist within the organization today. They might be roles that you need to outsource. They might be roles that you need to hire. The last piece then is the roadmap. And again, when you tackle kind of a broader data and analytics initiative through the strategy that you set, you're never going to tackle everything at once. Nobody's going to wait for a 2-year build of some large enterprise data environment. You want to see incremental progress. So what we try to do within the roadmap is say, in the first quarter, let's go deliver X. And really get into, at a minimum, a quarterly cycle where we're seeing progress. As I've been on different data and analytics teams, we've improved over time. We do get into a 2-week cadence where we're giving new information to the business every 2 weeks. We have a nice solid ingestion of requirements. We're prioritizing those requirements, and we're constantly getting out the most important stuff. And it's coming quickly. Nobody's waiting more than 2 weeks to get a super high priority item. It just works smoothly. So these are really the 5 main outcomes of a well thought out data strategy. You're going to have prioritization. You're going to have a model for the business, concept of a solution you're going to put in place, and a roadmap to get there. All right, let's go to the last polling question. So how well is the structure in your organization's overall strategic data vision? So do you have a good structure in your organization? Dedicated team for it, good technical elements, or are there big gaps there from a strategic point of view?
No, wait, I'll give it a second before I give some of these results. But I had a question actually, Dave. So when you talk about those maturity models, what do you see as the the biggest challenge moving between the two of them? Getting to that next level. Going from hindsight to foresight. What is holding institutions back?
Yeah, a lot of times what holds an organization back is they haven't put in the foundational effort to really have a good set of data that they can then do predictive and prescriptive analytics on. I think we try to shortcut sometimes and move into machine learning and move into data science projects. And then those teams get bogged down in just acquiring data, scrubbing data, reorganizing the data to actually move something out. Number one. But number two, in moving those forward, is identifying a reasonable use case, right? Data, when you move into that prescriptive predictive element, it is almost like a science experiment. We're saying, I'm not sure what's out there, but I've got a hypothesis about a correlation that exists in this data. And effectively, you have to go kind of test it, fail, test it again, until you come up with the right answer, and then move that forward. So it's really around the data they have being clean, well structured, and then having a good, valid use case to actually move it forward.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. So what do we've got? We've got about 50% with B here, and then split 25% on A and C.
Which sounds almost just like we did from a data governance perspective. Yep. Okay, perfect. All right, so that was it. So to kind of pull this together, when we talk about driving value from your data, beyond the elements of compliance, right? Sean talked a lot about what are the elements that have to go into compliance, types of data that you have to bring in there, but that can be a struggle for organizations. To get away from that struggle, there are really two kind of key programs you need to look at in the organization. One, what's your data and analytics program, period? How do you move data through the organization? What's your strategy to prioritize the data elements that go in? What's the team that's going to do that? That's all the second part of my conversation around data strategy. The first part of our conversation was all around governance. Do we have a good way that we're talking about data, common language around the data? Do we have policies and procedures in place to make sure that what information we move is of high quality, we understand it, and we have the right governance around it? All right, so we'll jump into the questions, kind of last piece.
Yeah, hey Sean, hey Dave. Great presentation. Definitely a timely topic with the clock ticking down on CECL, as well as just, I know year in, year out with our technology survey, we hear about concerns on the data governance side. So this is super timely. We are going to take some Q&A, folks, so we do still have time for questions. If you've got any, definitely chime in, and we'll try to get through as many of these as possible. So the first question, guys, and it came in quite a while ago, so I'm not sure if it's specific to CECL, so you may want to break this up, maybe CECL specific and more generally. But this person asked, what is the advantage of outsourcing the data governance project implementation versus using the bank's own resources and data models?
I can talk about outsourcing governance. I don't think you would. I was actually kind of noodling on this morning for whatever reason. I don't think you would ever really want to outsource governance, right? Mm-hmm. You, as an organization, need to own the governance function. What you want to outsource is going to a partner that's done that for other organizations in the past, can help you with the framework, can help you get the right policies and procedures in place, can help you sort through. There are so many things that you could write policies and procedures about. It's good to go to an outside party to help you prioritize those and then build them first off, and build them with standard practices that they know have worked for other organizations in the past. But they should then enable you to actually run your data governance program. Maybe come back as an outside party and audit. Hey, are people following these policies and procedures? But definitely would want to just own that as an organization should be key.
John, is there a CECL? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that from a CECL side, the same sort of idea. I kind of see a trend of when they're outsourcing their CECL method and solutions, they're taking the whole thing, right? And they want the governance, they want the policies, but we really think that no matter what they're outsourcing, the governance or data or not, the bank really should know what data is going to the outsourcer, know what policies are going to them, and so really understand that the data that's going to them is their data, is the operations data, it's the right data, and the answer that's being spit out is again specific to them. So it kind of gets into this black box mentality of some of these models, and relying on the black box, but really knowing, well, what is the black box doing, and what is the data that I'm giving to them, how is that impacting when things change? So really, yes, keeping responsibility for that data and the governance within the bank.
Well, with that in mind on the CECL side, because a lot of banks out there are using software providers and those sorts of things. So how can they ensure that their vendor, that information they're doing, that it's accurate?
I think there's a couple answers to this. Validation, we keep recommending validation. I mean, it's going to be required after implementation, whether it's on annual or it's going to be required. But we really see a benefit in getting some of these models validated beforehand. Use 2022 to get the model validated so that you're confident that the model is working the way it's saying it. We worked with a perfect example of this was not for CECL, it was for an ALM client, but they thought the prepayment methodology was being vectored and it was changing based on interest rates. But when we went to validate it, we couldn't get to that answer using the same vector. And in fact, it was actually just a constant prepayment. So none of constant or vectored is right or wrong, but the client just was unaware of it. So a validation was able to kind of get that out. But that allows you to fine tune it as well. And we think really trying to get the model specified early in 2022 so that you have time to do these things. So you're, again, confident in 2023 that the answer that is being fed out of the black box is accurate.
Now, Dave, there's a question here around ownership of the data analytics program. And I know you were definitely advocating that the institution should own that program. But do you have any further clarity on how that should break down in the organization on who owns that data analytics program?
Yeah, I think it comes down to how you're going to design the program. Usually the programs, when you design a program, you might get into the notion of a center of excellence. And in the center of excellence itself can have different components that either live like within IT or live outside in the business. In general, obviously everything infrastructure-wise, core security access, hardware or cloud level elements live within IT. Sometimes that IT will have more of a business function around what are the models we're creating and what data are we loading in there. But in reality, you get the SMEs out in the business and you shift some of that. So you have core infrastructure in IT, but a lot of times the analytical elements will be spread out in the business. And you generally will have a steering committee that kind of brings it all together to make sure the whole program is executing on more enterprise-wide priorities.
Now, with that in mind, any tips for setting the tone at the top? You mentioned that management has an important role in taking some leadership there. So what's some tips there?
I think driving what the value of looking at data as a strategic asset and not just a thing that needs time and effort to manipulate and produce over and over. Probably if you're very interested in this stuff, I would recommend the book Infonomics. Does an excellent job of kind of outlining what is the economic value of data and how our organization's leveraging it.
I love ending a webinar with a book recommendation. So I think with that, it's time to close this up. As a reminder to everyone, you will receive the recorded version of this webinar within 24 hours. You can expect that in your email. We'll also post the webinar on bankdirector.com. I want to thank Dave and Sean. Thanks so much to you both for a lot of great information this afternoon. Thank you to Baker Tilly for co-hosting today's webinar, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for having us.